What I want to try to talk about today is the problem of whether or not one size fits all. I've spent a lot of time in the course of my career working with students, and in a previous job I had, I was at the University of Wisconsin, and there were students at the time who were just sure that if they had had the chance to work on healthcare reform back in 1993, that they would have been able to do what Hillary couldn't. Because they could sit down, they could stare at the information, they could look at it because they would know what to do. And on the other hand, the people who just swarm and overload everybody with so much information because they're sure that if you just put it out there, if you build it, they will come. But as we know, often what happens when information is just tossed out is that people sit there and try to figure out, what am I going to do with this? So I want to talk about the fact that so often there's one-size-fits-all approaches to information, to performance, to management, to results, just too often doesn't work, but to end up with what I think are some more positive ideas about what it is that will. But to get at that, I want to begin by talking about a dog that my wife and I had once upon a time. We had a golden retriever, and we had this golden retriever in Philadelphia. We lived on the 14th floor, and the idea of a golden retriever on the 14th floor of an apartment building may not seem like a very good match, but she loved it. And she loved it in part because every night when we'd go out, be your last trip for the evening, she'd go sniffing around. And we were living in downtown Philadelphia. And if you know downtown Philadelphia, and you know what happens at 11 o'clock at night, there are fairly good odds that one of the great Philadelphia Volkswagen-sized rats would go running across. And she would think this would be just terrific, because for her, a rat that was sort of yay big was just one giant stuffed dog toy. And she thought it'd be great fun to be able to go out and just chase the rat. I said, no, you can't do that. So I would always let her take a run at it, scare the rat, have some fun, take her back in, not get too close to the thing. Because as we know, rats are not good. Everybody knows that rats are not good, right? I mean, what's wrong with rats? This is the audience participation portion of our presentation here. Why are rats not good? They carry disease, exactly. Rats are not good, and we know from history that rats have gone around in the past biting people and spreading plague. So as long as there have been large concentrations of people, there have been rats, and as long as there have been rats near large concentrations of people, there's been disease. So the way to try to solve the problem of disease in many ways is to try to get rid of rats. And one of the things that, in fact, has been the case for a long time is that the rats, and again, this is back from Philadelphia, this is 100 years ago with the Philadelphia City Rat Patrol. And they were out on patrol to find the rats. This was the Bureau of Health Rat Receiving Station with a horse and buggy with the Bureau of Health Rat Patrol going around near the harbor and near the docks, bringing in the rats. And these people were all, as you can tell over here on the right side, working very hard to try to do the one thing that everybody agreed had to be done, which is to get rats off the streets. The problem has been around for a long time, back in the Middle Ages, and today as well. Let me show you another slide about the way in which the city of Baltimore attacked the problem of rats by using performance measures to get at it. What the city did was to create a citizen call-in system that if you saw, they had a program called one of the great program names of all time, the Rat Rub-Out Program. And if you found a rat, if you saw a rat, that you could call in and report it to the city. And the city promised it would do something about the rat. And here is the city's chart tracking where rat complaints were coming in. And if you start looking at this, all this is simply a count of where rat complaints come in from, with the higher concentration being ultimately going from dots to darker shades of red. Well, you remember, by the way, a footnote, where was the previous Philadelphia Rat Patrol site? But it was along the city dock, right? Look along the docks in Baltimore, and what do we see about rat reports there? Not much. How? You mean there are no rats on the docks of Baltimore? What's going on here? There are very few people living on the docks of Baltimore, so there are relatively few citizens who were encountering rats, calling and making complaints. So first, an important piece of indication and information here that's useful. Doesn't mean there aren't any rats. This is the places where citizens encounter rats. The other thing too, and there are lots of history we could go into, but you see that there are two fairly large concentrations where rats are in higher numbers than others. So what this tells you is that there are some places where you need to pay attention in particular, which the mayor did as part of CityStat. So the next thing is, okay, you're at the CityStat meeting and the mayor says, we've got complaints for rats. We've got two places in particular where they're bad. I want the problem taken care of, and I'm going to come back next week to see how well that you've done. So who's in charge? I actually asked this question to a group of Chinese government officials who were visiting, and they were befuddled by this because in the Chinese system of administration, there is an agency that's responsible for everything. So somebody put up their hand and said, the Department of Rats? And if there's one thing that we know, that's exactly the wrong answer to the question, because there is no Department of Rats. And if you think about this in a broader framework, the one thing that we do not, cannot, would not want to do is to create a new agency for every problem. And here's the case clearly where it makes no sense to have a Department of Rats to solve the rat problem, which is real and which, as I said before, everybody knows we need to take care of. So which agency is in charge of solving the problem? I'm the mayor. I've got a problem with rats. I want you to solve it. I want you to get the rats out of here. And the agency that's going to be in charge of this is what? More audience participation portion of our program? Who's in charge? Department of Health? I'm sorry? Public Works. Health. Human Services. Animal Control. Sanitation. Garbage pickup. Rats love living in garbage. And we can go on. On top of that, what it turns out also is that these are areas where there are large numbers of abandoned housing. And so it turns out that the housing piece gets brought in as well. So who's in charge? Well, it doesn't take too long till you get about a dozen different agencies involved. The thing that's important about this, about taking the problem, got to do something about rats, and using it and capturing the problem in a way like this that is performance-based and graphically driven, is that first, everybody quickly we had a dozen agencies right off the top of our heads. Who's in charge? Which one is in charge? They're all in charge. And so if you're the mayor, you want to take care of the rats, who's responsible? You have multiple agencies in charge. The thing about this next is that it's very hard to say, well, it's not my job, because it's the Department of whatever. Very hard to deflect responsibility. If there's a problem that everybody agrees has to be solved, and where you have a piece of the action, it gets to be much easier for the mayor to be able to hold people accountable, because it's the problem that has to be solved, not a program that has to be managed. And you could track the ability of the city to be able to move the needle by the numbers. But the other thing, too, that's most important here is that, as we all know, the first instinct is, oh, yes, this is an important problem, and the agency in charge of the problem is over here. One of the things that happens when you take problems that everybody agrees has to be solved and couples it with performance measures that track your ability to be able to do it and portray it graphically is it gets to be very hard, because at this point you can run but you can't hide. And it creates strong incentives for agencies to work together, because it becomes more clear about who's got which stake in the problem, and it creates the language for collaboration, and in some ways even for culture change, that's very hard to get at otherwise. Just notice, if you think back, the short conversation we've had in the first 7 minutes. By talking about, yeah, rats, it's funny, but we know we got to solve them. Who's in charge? Everybody's in charge. Where are the problems? There are the problems. Which agencies are in charge? Think about how the very presence of this map changes the conversation and changes the cultural conversation instantly in a way that just our talking back and forth never would. That's incredibly powerful. Another illustration of this. This is from the Recovery Act, and there are lots of things that, as you go back to look at what happened when the Obama administration came in, they came in, huge economic collapse. They wanted to get money out. want to get money out in a hurry to try to have as much impact as they could, as quickly as they could. But one of the things that they also did was that they were terrified as they were dumping $800 billion of money out into the cities, was that there would be fraud, waste, and abuse stories that would plague them for eternity. So they said the one thing we're going to make sure is we don't have that. So they determined from the very beginning to create a performance system to go along with it. And the performance system was structured in a way to track who had which program where. So this is an example of a program that was set up in Boston, and they mapped, you could put in your zip code, your address, any place in the country, and find out what the Recovery Act was doing in your neighborhood. And there are different colored dots here, where the green dots are contract programs, the blue dots were grants, and the purple dots, and there aren't really any around here, are loan programs. And if you click on each of the dots, you can find out which agency is involved in which program spending how much money. So I put this up in front of a group of college freshmen. And we started clicking on it, and one agency was doing this, another agency was doing that. And after 25 seconds of looking at it, one of the college freshmen put up her hand and said, I wonder if they're talking to each other. Think about the power of a picture that within 25 seconds gets a college freshman without any previous training in this field whatsoever to ask precisely the right question. What we have with performance information presented in the right kind of way is incredible power that breaks through barriers and cultures and forces conversations because it gets out of agencies, out of programs, and gets to issues that matter where people live and drives people to ask about the right kinds of questions. Whether it's who's in charge of solving the problem of rats and are we making progress, or we're trying to solve the problem of spurring the economy. So the first point that I want to make is that information can be a very powerful bridge for creating connections among agencies that in the absence of the information often wouldn't happen at all. It changes the language by creating pictures that once you see it, it's one of those things, boy, I can't forget that. You probably won't forget rats. And once it's in the back of your head, if you can't forget it, you create the foundation for doing something about it. Information creates that kind of power. That's my first point. The second point is that we have the problem of supply and demand in information. And this gets back to what I discussed previously. The problem so often in this information performance business is that I get it. Yeah, I love it. This information is important. We're going to have open source data. It's going to be out there for everybody to see. This is going to be terrific. We're going to follow it. We put the information out there and great things will happen. And what happens too often, to the frustration of people who are involved, is that the information is created and everybody sits there and stares at it, and critics and cynics say, well, nothing happened there. Why do we bother? I mean, how many times have you looked at the performance question and have asked, why doesn't anything happen? There's the Government Performance and Results Act that was passed originally back in 1993 that required all federal agencies to define their strategic goals and to develop performance measures to assess their success in meeting those goals. And again, more audience participation. Is anybody opposed to that? Having federal agencies explain what they're trying to do and measure their success in doing it? And this was 1993, a little while ago, but it passed unanimously by voice vote in the Senate. So they said, well, why not? And so it became law. And what happened is that some agencies tried to do it. A lot of them said, I'm not sure. And it had very modest impact. The one thing that one of the few things that Congress agreed on unanimously, turns out not to have any impact, or very little. And the answer was that it created lots of supply. At that time, I was in Wisconsin. The people who were in that state loved it because a major export of Wisconsin is paper. There are a lot of trees that got killed, and a lot of paper that got made, and a lot of reports that got written that in the end nobody much read, including by members of Congress who created the law that the people using all the paper were required to file. We have now a new Reform Act that was passed in 2010 that for the first time requires not only better strategic plans, but also requires that the plans all be in sync with each other. So we can't have agencies on different calendars. When the new administration comes in, everybody will have the chance and will be forced to do it all again from scratch as the new administration comes in. Has measurable targets with priority goals and cross-agency goals. And there is the beginning of some senses that for the first time, agencies are actually paying much more attention. Why? Because there's more of an effort to try to move from mandating information because it's a good thing in itself to creating information that will be used. That is, to take information away from mostly a supply side to creating demand for the information. Because if you create information for which there's an audience, information for which there's a use, it's much more likely that, surprise, the information will in fact be used. That simply tossing it out there is not likely to create the demand for the information, or put differently, we can end up having a huge amount of cost that's invested to get the stuff out there. We can create information faster than we can use it. People feel overwhelmed. And as one of my professors in graduate school always used to remind me, essentially, don't get too cocky, because remember that the political system is perfectly happy and capable of making decisions all the time without paying any attention to any of this information whatsoever. And it's something for those of us in the business to remind ourselves is there's no particular reason why anybody ought to pay any attention to any of this, except if it turns out to be useful. And a way that in fact it has been. Again, part of the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act required agencies to set strategic plans. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which sadly, given the long history in this country, is not one of the better managed historically agencies in the federal government and dealing with some of the most difficult problems the government has to try to solve, face the problem of trying to figure out what to do. And here are some results. The problem, 1.9 million Native Americans, 566 tribes, 310 reservations, with violent crime 2.5 times higher than the national average. This is a serious problem. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs said, in response to the Office of Management and Budget's mandate, the requirement was every agency had to go out and set their strategic priority goals. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs, given these numbers, said, we want to try to reduce violent crime on Indian reservations. And so OMB said, okay, by how much? And they said, 1%. And given the fact that the trend is going the other direction, they thought this is a stretch goal. And the response that they got back was, get serious. 1% is not serious. It doesn't represent a serious commitment. It's a rounding error. How are we even going to know? Forget about it. Come back with something better. So they said, 5%? And so OMB said, give it a shot. Turned out that on 4 reservations where they engaged in significant efforts, violent crime exceeded the 5% target. In fact, they hit 35%. Violent crime, 4 reservations, down 35%. How did that happen? And it turned out there was a guy in charge of this operation who believed in performance. He said, the problem is violent crime is going up. By how much and where? And the answer is BIA didn't know, because they didn't keep very good statistics. They had all this stuff sitting around in handwritten reports, so they had a team of people who went with a stack of paper that were handwritten reports, and they computerized all the data. They had people who sat down by hand, entering the reports one at a time in a database. And for the first time, they got a picture of where crime was happening, which reservations were having problems with crime, where on the reservations they were having problems with crime, when the problems were happening. And it turned out, if you know the story of CompStat, you know the story of performance management, you know the story of the rest, you'll not be surprised to discover that there were clusters of problems. It turns out there were some days, especially weekends, where there was more crime than others. Some times a day, especially late at night to the early morning, where there's more crime than others. It turns out there were some places that were more likely to be occasions of crime than others. And so what they then did was to apply predictive policing to put the cops where they expected the crimes to be before the crimes were committed. And it turns out they were able to either prevent or to capture the bad guys after stuff happened. And on top of that, they created a sense that in the community that people were actually cared, that they were paying attention. It became part of the communication with citizens that we hear you, we're listening, we're paying attention, because there were a lot of reservations in the past where people didn't even bother reporting the crimes because their assumption was that nobody would do anything about it anyway. The introduction of performance management by simply counting what happened where transformed everything and brought violent crime down 35%. The target was 5, they made it 35%, and they did it largely by putting a few more cops out there, but being much smarter about where they put cops. The information was already sitting there. They're getting these police reports in, it was just sitting in big stacks. Nobody was paying any attention to it. It only became when the demand for the information became coupled with what they had, and they used the demand for the information to try to drive police behavior and use the police behavior to try to reduce crime, which is what everybody wanted to have happen, and that's where the difference occurred. So time after time after time, we shovel more information out there, but it only matters if there's demand to go along with it. And if the information that we have drives solutions to problems that we want to try to attack. So my third point, all this has got to be useful, coupled with the problem of demand, but also a quick story. Here's a picture of the Space Shuttle Columbia. And as you may remember, there was a very sad story associated with this. On launch, the shuttle took off, and there were insulation panels that were on the bottom of the shuttle, and they, enormous vibrations, some of them shook off. This happened all the time. But on this launch, there were some larger pieces that fell off. And not only did they fall off, but it turns out, they discovered later, they hit the underside of the shuttle as the shuttle was being put into orbit and damaged some of the heat tiles that were at the bottom, so that when the shuttle came back in, it got super, super hot. There was no insulation there to protect it, and the shuttle disintegrated. It's an incredible tragedy, and created one of these moments for NASA where not only it led to the loss of lives of the astronauts on board, but also a fundamental problem of trying to figure out, how do we screw this up? Well, it turns out that, as you all know, they have cameras trained on shuttles from all directions as the shuttle's going up. But the question is, what if they had known about this in advance? They did. Between the time of launch and the time that the shuttle had re-entry, there was a lot of study that was being given. And I want to show you one of the PowerPoint slides that was presented from a government contractor to NASA. This is the PowerPoint slide. And the point of the slide was that the shuttle's in serious trouble because of the insulation that damaged the heat tiles on launch. This is the point that the slide was trying to make. And again, to repeat, this is the slide that was shown to NASA. However, is it remotely clear that that's what the message of the slide is? Because if you start reading this, review of test data indicates conservatism for tile penetration. The existing SOFI on tile test data used to create crater was reviewed along with SCS14 Southwest research data, which means we went out and we used the data that we had to see what we could learn. This was the main point. So you know the way the hierarchy PowerPoint slides make. This is the lead point. Everything else is subsidiary to that. Then crater over-predicted penetration of tile coating significantly. Initial penetration to describe, so it's not even grammatically correct, by normal velocity varies with volume mass of projectile. for example, 2,000 foot per second for 3 cubic inches. Significant energy is required for the softer SOFI particle to penetrate the relatively hard tile coating. Test results do show that it's possible at sufficient mass and velocity. So, 2/3 of the slide, and we've learned precisely nothing. Then we get to the important stuff. Conversely, once tile is penetrated, SOFI can cause significant damage. So you got to get 2/3 down before you get to the uh-oh. And further on down, minor variations in total energy above penetration level can cause significant tile damage. Okay. But flight condition, that is where they are now, significantly outside test database. Volume of ramp is for test. So that what we have are 2 pieces of information that matter. First, once the tile is penetrated, it can cause significant damage, and where we are now is significantly outside what we know. So you have to really read very carefully to get what the point is. And my question is, flight condition is significantly outside test database. By how much? Once tile is penetrated, SOFI can cause significant damage. How much? Is this be afraid, be very afraid, or just something we need to pay attention to? Is this a warning to NASA from Boeing? You can see the Boeing logo down here at the bottom. It's January 2003. Is this something that they need to worry about? It turns out afterwards that the Boeing engineers were really worried that what happened on launch was a very significant damage to the launch vehicle, which could cause very serious problems. This is their presentation to NASA to try to make the point, which makes no point whatsoever. So if you've got the information, that's great. But if you don't succeed in communicating it to people who are making decisions in a way that the decision makers can actually pay attention to and make sense, what's going to happen? And NASA managers, yet again, were stunned when what happened, because here's their briefing, and they saw what was going to happen, and what they had happen didn't warn them in advance of what was going to happen, even though NASA's contractors knew. So the points that I want to make, and we can talk about this much more in the Q&A, is that information is incredibly valuable, but it's most valuable in being able to build bridges and change cultures, because it creates the opportunity for conversations that would not otherwise happen. The second point is that it only works, though, if there's demand as well as supply for the information that's being created, and works on top of that if it's useful and communicated in a way that actually makes sense for people to be able to solve. Because I guess the point I want to end with is that we often talk about measurement as being incredibly important. And let me make a kind of argument that is designed to be troublesome. Performance is not about measurement. If you make it about measurement, you lose the game. Performance and measurement and information have to be about communication. And if it's not communication that's effective, you lose. If it creates good conversation that leads to productive answers, it's good. So to think about the role that information can play in government, the key is trying to understand performance and information not as measurement, but as communication, and that it works best when it communicates well. Thanks so much. We have some conversation, I think, coming.
Thank you very much. So I think one of the biggest questions that I know that I get a lot in the work that we're doing, and it's something that we focused on a lot in Maryland and that I know that a lot of you are grappling with, is if you've got executive willingness to do this work. We had Martin O'Malley in Maryland. We've got other great leaders across our nation who are really excited and very much psyched about doing this work. And we also have a lot of innovation that's happening on the front lines of government. So innovation happens on the front lines of government all the time. And when I was a probation officer in Maryland, one of the things, I was very vocal about some of the major issues and challenges that we had facing us. But oftentimes there's this permafrost in the middle of government. There's this inability to be able to kind of break through these middle layers. And it can either totally ruin your program or it can totally and it's sort of that duck and cover mentality. And so I know that you were really at a 30,000 foot level, but I want to take you back down a little bit to sort of the practicalities and how do we effectuate that culture change? I think everyone in this room is dealing with some culture challenges in their organizations. And so I'd love to hear from you and your experience working with governments around the globe. How do you do it? And what do you think the keys are, sort of?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question because on the one hand, you can have or not have executives at the top who are really sold on this. And you have citizens at the bottom. You have probation officers who are trying to do good work. But too often the problem gets lost in between. And in NASA's case, we had two major disasters, and in both cases it was the middle level where stuff got stuck. And you have internal language, you have people who just don't see the sense because there are ways we do things. The answer to this, I think, the way to effectuate culture change is not to say we're going to change the culture. Well, all right, okay, whatever you want to do, call it whatever you want. Or that we're going to increase measurement because people either game it or find ways of being able to deal with it. The key, I think, is to find a problem that people agree must be solved. Focus on the problem that can't be escaped. Focus everybody's attention on how to solve it, what their piece is of trying to solve it, and developing the measures and the indicators to back up the fact that progress is in fact being made. Because going back to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the way that they made progress was at the grassroots level to say, crime in reservations is bad, we've got to reduce it. How are we going to reduce it? We need better numbers. What numbers do we need? We'll get the numbers and we'll, if we have to, have people sit there 10 hours a day and put it in, and once we have the information, then we can act. But the problem has to become the driver, not the information, and even support from the top can be all important, but it doesn't matter unless it happens, especially at that middle level. But if you create a problem that people can't escape and use information to drive the solution, that's the key to making happen what has to happen, regardless of what label you put on it.
And are you convinced that leadership isn't the key? I mean, I always thought that it was leadership. I thought that because O'Malley had my back that I could do this work. Can this happen in isolation in other organizations when you don't have that sort of executive sponsorship, that lever to pull?
Yeah, absolutely. Leadership is absolutely essential, and I don't in any way mean to minimize it. But we have two kinds of problems out there. One is that you have, in the case of O'Malley, a leader who really believes in this, but as we all know, leaders can announce all kinds of things and can even have your back, but what's going to make anybody pay any attention? And on the other hand, suppose that we have, say, a big new program. Let's call it the Affordable Care Act. And we're going to make sure it's going to be one of the signature things, say, of our entire administration. And we want to have it be a huge success. And we don't pay any attention to it. You can either have support or lack of support, but either way, more support's better than not having it, but it's got to focus on why it matters, what the problem is, and how to go about solving it. Because I've gotten to the point, I guess, and it's, so having been around the track enough times that there's so many ways you can take a pass, slide around, mandates, leadership, and all kinds of other things. The question in the end is, what's going to improve government's ability to be able to deliver results for citizens? And in the end, it's got to be on demonstrating that this is a problem that matters and we're going to produce results. And if you can use that, that can drive so much of everything else.
And it can be a call to action. So using data as a call to action, not only internally to government, but also how do you get the public? I mean, a lot of the things that government is trying to solve, they will not be able to solve if they do it in a vacuum. If they try to do, we can't improve the environment. We can't surface and repave every road in the state if we don't know where the problems are, if we can't collect the right information, and if we can't get citizens to participate in the solutions. And so how do you suggest citizen engagement work? Where have you seen it working anywhere? How do we encourage citizens to get more engaged in the business of what government is meant to be doing?
And it's got to be much more the process of the transaction between citizens and government. But I step back with one observation, and this is sort of a trivia question. Can you imagine any one problem that matters that any one government agency can control? And I've done this in front of a bunch of audiences, and I've yet to come up with anybody who can suggest any one problem that matters that any one organization can control. So if solutions to problems that matter are by their definition multi-organizational, and that you can't put any one organization in charge anyway, because even if you did, then you'd create the same problem just in a different way. What you've got to do is to find ways of harnessing organizational capacity to produce results that citizens care about, which gets back to the problem of saying, okay, the CDC, we've got a major problem. The media is completely out of control on this. They've discovered they can scare the living daylights out of everybody and the ratings go up. What is it that we really care about? We want to keep citizens safe. Who's in charge? Multiple agencies. How do we try to talk about the performance of government? We talk about the way that government's going to respond, and then we're in the back office wired together by information systems about who's going to have which piece of the action to ensure that things work. Because the fact is that the CDC has been savaged for its reaction in Dallas, and as best I can tell, the problem had to do with the fact that people in Dallas weren't following CDC's prescriptions. It wasn't really the CDC's problem. But all right, who cares? CDC is a good target. Nobody's going to blame the poor local hospital and the nurses and the doctors are trying to care it. Problems that matter.
It's election time.
Exactly. It's election time. Hey,
honest.
and in Texas in particular, they got guys who are involved in election running. It has to come back to, there's a problem, we're going to solve it, requires a multi-organizational response. The multi-organizational response is driven by data that defines the problem and drives the solutions.
Any questions out here for Don? I'll keep on going. Don't tempt me. Okay. Well, I think that in terms of the work that we've seen in the field, working with different governments that are doing this work, I think culture has been a big issue. Citizen engagement has been a big issue, and how to integrate citizen engagement. And then also, I think one of the things is sustainability. How do you craft that program or build your program out so that it sustains? So when there's a new governor or a new mayor, that it doesn't get rolled over and that the performance management is still relevant. Any final words on how to create sustainable programs that are lasting and that will roll through different administrations?
Yeah. And this is a tricky one because the first thing that the George W. Bush administration did when it came into Al Gore's National Performance Review and Reinventing Government was to shut the agency down. Shut the office down, closed it down. They were in 17th Street across the river here. Shut it down. Reinventing Government's over. We have our new plan. And so you either have new administration, the rest of what those guys did was crap, which is why we beat them, which is why we're in here. We're going to do things better now. But this is a problem and a set of issues that no top-level executive can any longer ignore. There are problems that require solutions. The solutions are multi-organizational. Multi-organizational solutions require performance information to drive them. Nobody can walk away from that. So one answer is just at 30,000 feet, the politics can play out as they do. Put new names, put new labels on it, but it's the key to reminding people that what matters if I'm government is how I interact with you, how well I serve you. Do I solve your problems? Do you have a voice coming back to me to tell me about the problems you need to be solved? Can we create that conversation? And for people who are not at the highest levels, that problem's not going to go away regardless. You put new labels on it. You can learn from what happened before. A new administration comes in, sometimes you get a jolt of energy because a new administration will come in and maybe announce new initiatives. There are new things that you might want to try so that the process is continuously learning. So that the trick is to allow the politics to work itself out, because to ask a new administration to embrace warmly everything that the administration is replacing, that's not realistic. But at the same time, helping the new administration to understand that this is its problem, this is a solution, and finding a way to encourage that is one of the most important things that most folks like us can possibly do. Because the thing is that they're the Martin O'Malley's of the world who say, I'm going to run Baltimore by creating systems that allow us to rub out rats. And we're going to take that then to the state, and I'm going to make this the centerpiece of my administration. I'm going to use it to try to clean the Chesapeake Bay. There are people here who work for governments whose chief executives have decided similar kinds of things. There are a lot of executives out there who don't think about that as the first thing that they think about when they get up in the morning, whether it's Barack Obama, who's clearly not thinking about that as the first thing, because it really isn't paranoia if they are out to get you. And that's the problem that he's got with the Republicans on the Hill. So this is not fairly low-level priority issue. Same with governors and mayors and other local executives. But the fact is, the problem doesn't go away. Government's gotten more complicated. Problems have gotten more difficult. All the conversation about shrinking government has nothing to do with the fact that people expect government to solve the problems they care about. Government's got to engage citizens, and the language of that engagement, both sides, has got to be performance. So it's helping for the people who don't get it at the top, either to not make things worse by messing it up, or to at least allow those kind of conversations to continue.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to you all for hanging in there with us. And I think, Cam, I'm going to invite you back up to introduce the next panel, but thanks very much to Don.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks much.